and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. My name is Steve Donaldson, and I'm your host and moderator. This is the first in what we hope will be an ongoing series of philosophical dialogues with everyday people. The topic for this evening is, what is love? So to get the ball rolling, I thought what we'd do is have each one of you introduce yourselves and give a one-liner definition or reaction to the question, what is love? So why don't we start on my far right and we'll work our way over to the...
I'm Ken Thompson. Love is the answer. We're here to find the question.
I'm Dave Rude, and I think love means sometimes having to say you're sorry.
I am Carol Abel, and it is a mystical, magical experience.
My name is Scott Van Bergen. Love is the highest and often the most troubling emotion that we can discuss.
My name is John Titus, and love can make you happy or it can make you miserable.
My name is Jeff Johnson. If I knew what love was, I'd be cuddled up on the couch with dinner and a movie tonight probably, but I think it is the probably profoundest expression of our incompleteness as human beings.
My name is Steve Semenik, and I think that love makes the world go round.
My name is Adele Abrahams, and I think that love is both a feeling and a commitment and a practice.
My name is Jerry Hummel. I like what Edric Fromm says about love in his book, The Art of Loving. He says that love is care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge.
Hi, my name is Mike Grosso, and sometimes I think love is the one illusion worth getting lost in.
Okay, so now we're just going to make it an open free-for-all. Anybody has a comment or want to take it off from there and raise your hand? John, why don't we start with you, and after John, who will we have over here? Mike, okay, go ahead, John.
I take it we're talking about romantic love. Is there any other kind of love that we'd like to talk about?
Okay. We'll go to Mike and then
goes
Scott.
To my question, I was going to say, unless you decide in advance that you're going to talk about romantic love, the concept, the idea of love is very large, and I would at least consider 2 or 3 different forms of love, or be open to the varieties of love. I mean, there is erotic love, and there's spiritual love, and there's brotherly love, and there's affection, and there's friendship, an underrated form of love, in my opinion. And I hope that we ramble through all the possibilities as we go on.
Okay, Scott, and then who do we want? Then down Jeff. Go ahead, Scott.
Yes, there are so many different concepts that are subsumed under the name love in the English language, and I think that's really problematic, because for me to say that I love my girlfriend, I love my son, I love humankind, or I love chocolate ice cream, in each case I'm talking about totally different things. And it's important to distinguish them, and since we don't have different words for them, we're relegated to having to describe saying love in this sense. I'm talking about romantic love here, or a different kind of love there.
Okay. Jeff, and then who do we want next over here? And then we'll go to David.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that one framework possibly for the discussion would possibly be capital L love.
Mm-hmm.
Like the love. And that does have sort of amorous connotations, I suppose, and erotic and infinite. I think that might not be a bad way to conceive of it, because we're not really talking about love of our dog or the small L.
So love with a big L. Would you...
Almost a platonic form, Steve, I would say.
Platonic, but would you say...
the color blue.
Does it have anything to do with intensity, the most intense kind of love? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. David?
Well, I'd like to offer a distinction between love the noun and love the verb.
Okay.
Because what Scott was alluding to is love the verb. And love, in that sense, is really the superlative positive emotion that we feel towards something or about something. But the noun love really is much broader, encompassing all the things that Mike brought up, and I would like to hit on the main ones that he mentioned, including platonic love, erotic love, spiritual love, fraternal love, These are all things that have many different dimensions, and I think we could probably spend an hour on any one of them.
Okay, if there are so many different kinds of love, what is it, would you say, that they have in common? What's a common denominator?
I think the one common denominator that all love has is that it's positive. I mean, we think of it in very positive terms, even though it might have some pitfalls and cause pain at some times. But I think when you say the word love, I think everybody pretty much has a positive reaction to that.
Okay. Steve's next.
I want to make a distinction, if possible, also between love and its stepsister, desire. So very often, especially when it comes down to erotic and sexual love, desire tends to be the operating function there, and the love tends to get lost. That's when someone is in love, that dizzy feeling of just wanting to be with someone all the time. I'm wondering myself if that really is love, or if it's something else that we tend to confuse with love. My personal feeling is that love tends to be much more concerned with the other's well-being and not necessarily what I want from that person.
Okay, Ken.
I'd like to point out that love itself seems to be related to desire, for which the German word is Lust, which has a different connotation in our culture. But the desire is an emotion that we might feel in ourselves, but in love seems to be much more of a field effect, because when we're in that space, the entire universe is running better. The sun is shining all the time. All your interactions seem to flow better than they normally would. So there is definitely, in my opinion, a field effect going on in the in-love equation.
Okay. Adele?
When we're in love, there's nothing that we have to do. It's very involuntary. And a lot of it, I think, well, I'm not putting it down. It's wonderful, hormonally driven, and then the chemicals that are released keep that going and feel wonderful. But when I think of love with a capital L, well, let me go back and say the trouble with in love is when you get to a certain age, you've been in love with a lot of people that then become bums about 6 months or 3 years later. So what happened to love? What happened? Where did it go all of a sudden? I really liked what you had to say, Steve, because there's a definition that I read, Stephen and Andrea Levine, who wrote a book on relationships, and I guess they do relationship seminars around the country, mostly on the West Coast, say that to love another is really to be willing to swim across the reservoir of another's pain. And that was touching. For me, that just touches on the empathy and getting into somebody else's world that you mentioned.
Okay, Carol.
When I learned what the topic was tonight, it brought back a lot of memories, because when I was in college, I wrote a paper on love. And at that time, I viewed it as a sort of a neurotic reaction, because love is a need to give and to take. We give love and we take love. And in a sense, that's a kind of, it's self-centered and it's rather neurotic.
Okay. Are we talking about different kinds of love again here? Is there like a needy love and a giving love? Would there be two different kinds of love?
Well, I think that basically you give to try to get.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, it's the same. In romantic love, love for your children, we give to our children, but we give to them because they give something back to us.
Okay. Jerry?
There's a troubling aspect of love for me, how it ebbs and flows. I think of my wife right now, and sometimes I'm much closer to her. I feel like we're more in sync, and other times we're more interested in doing our own things. So it kind of is like the tide, I think. I've never really understood, or I would like to know the mechanism of why it's not like constant. You love somebody, you marry them, or whether it's a pet, and It just sort of ebbs and flows, and I wonder how much of that is, you're talking about hormones and the chemicals in our brains, or just what's going on in our life. It's certainly a complex emotion.
Okay, John?
Well, infatuation is one kind of love. It's the obsessive kind of love with which a relationship starts. And it drives itself. It doesn't require any effort on the individual's part. It's the person simply carried away by the infatuation. But if that only lasts 18 months or a year, I think, even under the best conditions. And then it has to be replaced with something more intentional, a different kind of love, more of a intentional or committed kind of love. And it's normal for love to ebb and flow because everything else does. You can maintain a strong feeling. You can sustain a strong feeling only for so long. Even strong feelings such as fear, after a certain point, you can't feel it anymore.
Okay. Mike?
I just wanted to bring out a contrast which might take the discussion a little further. It seems to me that what we call romantic love, erotic love, sexual love, is markedly different from spiritual love, even though they're often intimately related in various ways. In the former, we are attracted to something that we like, and it tends to be one person, and we want to, essentially, it's an act of consumption. We want to absorb, use, enjoy that particular individual, and that's why it often turns into the opposite. As Catullus said, odi et amo, I hate you and I love you at the same time. So there's a dynamic that's very different from what is traditionally called in some circles as spiritual love or agapastic love. There, the love is not focused on one person and not for your own sake. The love object is not to be consumed and enjoyed, however exalted that enjoyment may be. The object of love is there to be helped, compassion comes into play. It's a love that's based on generosity and overflow, not need, but overflow. Whereas I think one of you said and pointed out rightly that the need is a factor in romantic love. And I would also add that the biological imperative to reproduce is the secret engine, in my opinion, behind erotic love. And that's why we often find it so disappointing as a form of love, because we get caught up by the spirit of this love and what is it really all about. But it's really the selfish genes in us that want to replicate and use us as individuals to carry on the species game. And the bitterness and disappointment of love often results from not understanding that. And I'm not putting love down, by no means. But I think it's important to understand that there is a profound dynamic in romantic or erotic love that differs from anything we might be tempted to call brotherly love, friendship, or spiritual love.
Okay, great. David?
Yeah, I think we're sometimes I think we're often trapped by the romantic notions of love. It's relatively new in Western civilization. I mean, in ancient times, love was not really regarded as a serious emotion. I mean, marriages were contracted, they were political. And I think that there's something that we all feel inside, and whether it's driven by our hormones or chemistry or just our thinking, it's something that's real. I mean, we've all encountered people that we instinctively dislike or we instinctively like. And you don't think about that. You meet someone and you form a simpatico. There's a communication that's non-verbal that makes you connect to them. And I think that we've all understood that. When I married my wife, she had a toddler daughter, and we were very concerned about her and how she would accept our relationship. And most children, young children, think of a new parent, so to speak, as a threat that they will not get as much of their mother's love, if this new person is in their life. And what we tried to explain to her is that love isn't divided like a pie. It grows like flowers, And the more love you have, the more you can have. And I think that there is very difficult. The question that we should be asking is romantic love possible without a more spiritual love of humanity? And I don't think that it is, but maybe somebody else has a different opinion.
Okay, great. Adele's next, okay.
Well, just to talk a little bit more about romantic love, David, it seems to be the thing that certainly gets us together, and it's wonderful. But when you think about the whole tradition of it, it was based on these women in court whose husbands were off fighting the Crusades, and the only guys around were these new, these teenage boys who were just coming into adolescence with their hormones raging. The love could never be consummated, or the women would be killed. So it had a tremendous amount of forbidden fruit to it, and these guys were bored and hanging around and singing these wonderful songs, and the women's husbands were off. And so it had so many of the elements of newness and forbidden fruit and never being able to be consummated. And if you think about it, 90% of our movies still have that theme and develop that theme. And my feeling is that most of us, myself included, get so caught into that notion of that intensity that when, of course, our warts emerge, as they have to when the newness wears off and you really get to know somebody, what then? That to me is really the beginning of the call to love.
Now, we were talking about different kinds of love, and two things I'm interested in, what they have in common, and on a follow-up on that is there a natural path from one to the other, or are they really separate things? I mean, is there a common theme and one leads to another, or are we talking about different phenomenon that have different purposes and came from different places? Any thoughts on that?
Well, personally, I've always reached when I've been able to reach it, the more elevated form through the romantic, although I know many people who don't. And it seems like some of the best marriages were in former times when they were arranged, and then people just committed to love each other. And they seem to do a really good job of it for the most part.
Okay, Ken.
The thing that unites all these definitions of love for me is the word resonance. As life forms, the human body is a collection of energetic signatures anywhere from our atoms on up through the organelles and the organs and the patterns that we live our daily life by. And when we find someone else or something else or some idea that resonates with us, is in a very real sense vibrationally attuned to our own vibrations, at least in the broader sense, so that we really get assistance from them and they from us in carrying forward this love project.
It sounds like perhaps, and let me test this a little bit, if there's a resonance, is that another way of saying that you see something of yourself in the other and the other in you? And would that relate to what David's question was? Can you really love somebody else if you're not loving yourself, or have a broader love for mankind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the resonance is that the vibration is shared. So definitely you're getting a reflection of your own self in the other. That's spoken of in many different literatures.
Jerry.
I'd like to go in a little different direction. I'd like to talk about what we call love, like the love of a mother, what we call unconditional love. It's my belief that there's no such thing as unconditional love. I think there's an element of reciprocity in love, at least between human beings. I think, for example, if a mother sacrifices her share of food for her child, or puts herself between a gun and puts her body in front of her child, some philosophers argue that the reason why that's done is that the mother values her offspring, or the idea of being a loving mother. She weighs that more in her hierarchy of values than her life. And so I was wondering if anyone, I think it's a controversial topic, and I'd like to see what the group thinks about that.
That whether unconditional love really exists at all.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, David, and then Mike will be after that.
I think if love is conditional, it's not love. I think that what we aspire to is the total giving of ourself for another human being or another cause. You know, you can love your country, you can love your wife, you can love your mother, you can love your daughter, but if you love with reservation, then it's not, in my mind, it's something else. It's not love. It's maybe compassion or a fondness or a willing to share. But love is really the total commitment of yourself beyond yourself.
Okay. Mike?
I appreciate what David said, but I have a slightly different take on that. It seems to me that I would not call maternal love, for example, unconditional in the sense that it's focused on your offspring. It's very biologically confined and driven. And I do think that, contrary to you, however, that the possibility of a unconditional universal love is there. And there are evidences, there are cases in history and in our lives from time to time that some of us, it may only be for a while or for periods of our lives, that we do reach out, and maybe some role we have to play, a physician or a teacher, or in the grand scheme of history, the great saints and whatnot, and great heroes of history seem to pour out their love unconditionally. And sometimes they do it in a very inconspicuous way. But I wouldn't want to sort of cynically, I don't mean to imply that you're cynical, but it sounds like a kind of a cynical put-down of the possibility, at any rate, of a more universal love. The reason I want to preserve the hope in that is, it seems to me, it's an absolutely essential form of love for us to survive and go forward as a species.
Well, let me comment on something here. I want to see if this is a distinction that we want to bring into the discussion, and that is selective love as opposed to conditional love. If one feels love towards one's own child, but maybe not somebody else's, that's selective. Does that necessarily make it unconditional? And what does it say when love is selective? We'll throw that out. But Carol's next over here, and pick up from there.
Well, I wanted to share with the comment you made about between parent and man-woman love. And I recall an instant when my first son was born, and he was about 5 months old. And I looked out the window. I was holding my son, and I looked out the window, and I saw my husband working in the yard. And at that moment, I was so impacted by my different feelings that my love, my son, was just totally overwhelming. And it did not even compare with my husband. And it gave me pause, because I wonder if any man and woman truly can reach that type of love that they have for a child. And also, I want to stir the pot a little bit here. We're making love so wonderful. I think maybe there's a dark side of love, too. And even people who start out in a very romantic and loving way, I think the majority of people, someplace along the line, turn into good companions, good friends. And how do you truly define love? Really, how do you truly define that word and that feeling?
Okay, Steve?
I also want to point out that not everyone may feel love with the same intensity. We talk about universal love, unconditional love, and David brought up the point about wanting, having this overwhelming commitment to something. Some people might not be capable of the overwhelming commitment. One person might go in the biblical sense of saying, "No greater love hath man than he who would lay down his life for another," and literally throw themselves in the path of an oncoming car to save a child they'd never met. Someone else might not be capable of that. It doesn't mean that they don't love or they're not loving universally, but they don't have it to that great an extreme. And I do believe that human beings, as varied as we are, do feel love with differing intensities. I don't think that everyone feels it to the same degree, and I don't even think that in any relationship that one person has, they may feel it to the same degree. You may love one person or desire one person more than another. You may have that one great love of your life you'll always remember, and then there have been others since then, but they're never quite the same.
Okay.
I think the whole notion of unconditional love is really insulting to the concept of love, because to have love without any conditions would mean to have love without any reason whatsoever. If somebody told me they love me unconditionally, it would be meaningless. I want somebody to love me for who I am and what they see in me that they value. And similarly, I choose to love people who possess characteristics that I value, and if they should become totally opposite of what they present, then I would most definitely withdraw my love.
Okay. Let's let Adele. Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff's next.
Well, just to that, I was going to say that I think that David mentioned that, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure that you can choose love, really. And so I'm sort of taking the other side of this. I think it's almost like it's an infection, really, and to that extent. And another point, too, goes to David's point quite a bit earlier, is this concept of, if we're, say, animals or, say, robots, and we're part of this clockwork universe and we have no control, then I don't believe we have the ability to love. As with that capital L, I think then we have motivations that are fairly base, and then we're not talking about love anymore. And so I think love is sort of prefigured on the idea of a soul. I'm not particularly religious, but I think if you have a soul, then you have an ability to love, and there are various degrees of depth of soul.
I'm curious now about this distinction between love that happens to you, like an infection, or you fall in love, it's not, and willful or participating consciously somehow that it sounds like a paradox or a contradiction.
I think, Steve, that's why this conversation is so difficult, because I think it's irrational. Mm-hmm. If you could quantify it and define it and say, okay, this is why I love something, then you probably don't. Mm.
Right,
yeah, I think I have to agree with everything that you said. Love really does seem to be the reckless emotion that we have very little control over, and as to the degree, as to whether love exists in a conditional or unconditional state, I really think that true love, I mean, when you talk about love as an ideal, not the way we practice it or what we call it, in our daily lives, but love as an ideal has to be unconditional. We can say that we aspire to love, to that ideal, and fall short. I think that we all have. Anybody who's been divorced or had love lost or been unrequited, understands that. But to aspire to the ideal, I think, is really part of our nature. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. If I were to love something because of some rational decision I made, I think that's maybe fondness or a strong liking, but I don't. That's so remote from what I understand as love. And when I was young, I had a very different interpretation of love. Love to me was desire. It was acquiring the affections of someone else, and as I've matured, I find that love is really all about giving and sharing and growing, and not about acquiring and partitioning. Because like I told our daughter, you don't cut love up like a pie. You grow it like flowers. One seed, one flower perennial begets many more, and the more you experience love, the more love there is for others to experience.
Okay, Adele?
Well, a few of you over there have just made some interesting comments that have really gotten me thinking. I like what you said about the idea of unconditional love more as an ideal than a state that we achieve, because I think of my daughter, for example. You were talking about your son, Carol. I think about my daughter, who I just adore and would do just about anything for, but I'll tell you, there have been days where, she's driven me crazy. I'm not in touch with my love for an hour or two on some of those days. And yet, if anybody stopped me in that moment, of course I would say and know that I loved her. And so I wonder if what you were talking about, Scott, where you said you'd want it to be conditioned, is maybe the distinction between the conditions for being involved with somebody and loving them. For example, I feel like I have a lot of love for my ex-husband, but there are certain conditions that make that relationship as a husband and wife not something I care to participate in anymore. So I have a lot of conditions for my involvement with people in different relationships, but I feel that there can be somewhat a feeling of constancy about the love.
Let me throw in another distinction here for people to chew on, and maybe you might want to come in if you like. And that's the issue of knowing somebody. Seems to me that unconditional love implies loving somebody the way they are. And Scott was referring to selective love as like, well, this is the kind of person I, would want to be involved in or have a relationship with or love. And what about the problem of how do you know somebody? And if you have expectations, maybe like a parent of a daughter, or you have an idea of somebody, of who this person is like, and it's as you go on, you find out, well, maybe you didn't really know this person. So in other words, the problem of being in love with an image of somebody as opposed to the person behind the image, how do we deal with that?
Clearly, when we first enter into relationships, it is mostly projection. It is our dreams and what we hope will be true based on little signs that we see there. And that's why I think for most of us, when the whole person comes into view and we have a much broader picture that they might have this quality, but then the opposite quality also, this is where we can often enter into a period of disillusionment. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think people really make tough and meaningful choices to also look at love as a spiritual path, and what do I bring here? What does this person bring? What of my woundedness is making that person act in defensive ways, and vice versa, and really using the relationship at that point as to learn how to love and walk the path of love as opposed to just rely on the easy, effortless feelings.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of just tied together what Jeff said earlier, that at the point of disillusionment is the point at which there's an opportunity to exercise some will or control or conscious decision, whereas before it might have been more like Jeff said, an infection, or you were just carried away.
It's my belief that there's no perfect partner out there. And granted, we leave for different reasons, but I think we need to learn to stay and realize there's no perfect partner, mm-hmm. that it might be this challenge in this relationship, but it's this challenge in another.
Okay. Ken?
I'd like to offer an analogy here. I definitely agree that love is not a logical process or rational decision-making. An example might be you might intend to go swimming and make rational decisions about which bathing suit to wear and getting your towel and which end of the pool to get in, and ultimately you've thought your way through this whole process of getting wet. Love is much more like getting caught in a sudden spring shower. You may even resist it at first, you may not like it, but ultimately you just have to relax and let it be, and that's the moment you know you're in love. At that moment when you relax and let it be.
And you're all wet?
And you're all wet.
Is there a distinction between passion? I mean, it sounds like passion to me. What's the relationship there? Is that?
Well, no, I think that the analogy will hold for any type of love, because it's not a rational decision. Mm-hmm. It's a sudden awareness that you're in that condition, rather than planning to get in that condition.
Now, what about the moment of disillusionment? Is there some decision-making that goes on there, or? Well,
ultimately, every spring shower comes to an end.
Okay. Okay, Jerry.
I'm thinking about preferences in romantic love, and kind of going back to Scott's comment a little bit earlier. It seems to me about maybe the irrational part, or the part that we can't really will or choose about love. Some people, I think it was maybe Masters and Johnson, and Freud certainly might say that when we're young we develop a kind of template in our minds. Maybe you prefer a brunette over a blonde or something like that. It's very interesting to me to notice if I'm watching television, say, and there's equally attractive women, and they seem to be nice individuals, nice personalities, but something about one of these individuals is more appealing than another, and it's nothing really, it's intangible. And so I think there's kind of a piece to it that we can't really choose. It's sort of maybe before we're conscious or aware can really make fully conscious choices. I think there's some groundwork that's laid down. So I want to throw that out there in case anyone has any ideas.
Okay. The idea of a template that we're attracted to that may not be so much involved with choice.
Right.
Yeah. John?
Well, I think a love relationship is an experiment almost, because after the first passion wears off, you have to try to define the relationship, to shape the relationship, and that often involves a good deal of pushing and pulling against your partner or with your partner, and often involves fighting and quarreling to find to set your limits and find your boundaries, and that can be quite painful, but also very necessary. And if you get through it, you're much better off.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, I just had a thought that I'll throw out and go back to the topic of romantic love or being in love. And I'm sure we've all had the experience, or at least observed it in others, that when someone's in love, caught up in the raptures of love, the object of their beloved stands out, looks beautiful, and the lover sees all the beauty and all the excellence and the virtue in the beloved. And the whole world lights up when you're in love, at least it does with me when I'm in love. Has it now? I'm not sure. Okay. Now, there's an interesting cognitive question. Are we, who are most of the time the average human being, especially, mature, workaday adults, not in that state of rapturous love? Are we, in a sense, not seeing what's there? Or is the lover, who is enraptured by the spectacle of the beloved, deluded?
Mm-hmm. Which is sane, which is insane? Yes, which is more one? Yeah.
I mean, is it a desirable thing to be swept away by this inspired vision of love, where everything looks beautiful and and you see all the virtues and excellences of the one that you love? It could be a child too.
Well, I remember one of the first times I was head over heels in love, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't eat, and I couldn't get my homework done. I said, "This is love? This is supposed to be good?" I can't, I couldn't do anything. I was like feeling very weak. It was a weak feeling, and I remember thinking that's pretty paradoxical. That love is supposed to be so great. Why do I feel so weak? So it's a good question of does it make us stronger, or does it make us weak? Or or different kinds of love have different effects.
Does it reveal or does it delude?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think with war, if you get through it, it makes you stronger. But we keep going back and forth talking about love, the nature of love, and the mechanics of love. And John was talking about the relationships and how it's sometimes troubling to make love work. And I think it may help us to focus on one at a time. And I'm committed to Eric Fromm's idea of the art of love, that we need to find our own love of ourselves before we can attempt to love another human being. And a lot of the mechanics of love, of sustaining a loving relationship, are really just practical. They're common sense. And if we think through all of the things that disrupted love in our life, we could probably work these out. But Erich Fromm's book is a good shortcut. And if we were to be tested by love, I think coming through that test and still being willing to love again is really the test of a person who is interested in achieving some sort of fulfillment in life.
So, question, just wondering, do you think theoretically then it's possible for any random pair of individuals to love each other?
No.
So there's...
No, I think there are probabilities. I think that you select any two human beings at random, depending on what their physical attraction is to one another, that some will instinctively like one another or desire one another. Some will be put off by the other, and the vast majority will fall somewhere in between.
So maybe there are two things that neither one by itself is sufficient, but you need both. One is some sort of template or natural attraction, and the other is some work. Is that what I'm hearing?
Or some spark. Sometimes the opposites that spark against one another, what they call in sitcoms sexual tension, sometimes make the best long-term relationships because they keep each other alive. But too often we find that people fall in love and then they find out who they fell in love with and then they fall out of love. So the mechanics of love are very important, but I think we ought not to get lost that the mechanics of love is not love, but the way you sustain love.
Okay. Steve is next over here.
Take it a little bit away from the notion of romantic love or being in love, and maybe even take it up to a higher level. First, I'm going to put myself out on a limb and venture a definition for love. I'm paraphrasing a few different sources here, but I would say that love is the willingness to expend energy in allowing or assisting someone else to grow to their fullest potential. Now, using that definition, you can love everybody, including people who are pointing guns at you and being willing to shoot you at that moment. Of course, what you might be able to do in that moment might be practically nothing, but it takes it out of the realm of the romantic love, of this desire, this numinous feeling about oneself, and say, hey, well, I can love anybody. And if one follows some of the religious ideals that have been espoused by some of the world's great religions, one should love everybody. And in doing this, it does require something of a conscious effort. It requires an effort to see that other person in light of what their potentials are, to, if you would, almost force that ability to see that other person highlighted and glorified and see all their good points. I think we can do that, but I think that by and large we're not inclined to, and that it takes a different kind of consciousness in order to carry that out. I think about the people who I've loved in my life. I've never stopped loving any single one of them. I may not be able to interact with them, somewhat like Adele said before. I may decide that I cannot share my life with this person because they're too destructive or what have you. They're taking and not giving. But I think the key, first off, is to know oneself and to learn to love oneself. I agree fully on that one, that you cannot love someone more than you love yourself. And I also believe the opposite is true. You will not allow anyone in your life to love you any more than you love yourself. And if you have a lousy sense of self-esteem and someone comes along and really wants to really love you, you'll find some way of sabotaging it at some point or another. I've have experience in that degree from both sides of the story. But so I guess that's about it.
Well, I want to tie some of this together because I think you've hit on some good distinctions here for helping me.
And this question of selective love versus universal love, and being able to broaden from maybe a few people to everybody, and requiring, it sounds like to me it requires, you mentioned higher consciousness, or being more conscious, or I would say mindful awareness, that the difference between you and others is not that great. It's this there but for the grace of God go I notion. Whereas if one relates in a more limited way, this person is like me, but those other persons are foreign, there's a separation. So I'm wondering if it may be involve will or decision, or it may be just becoming more conscious of what's already there, which is the commonality that we have with everybody. That's what it sounds like to me a little bit.
Well, if I may, yes, I agree. It is more about becoming conscious of the commonality, but also becoming conscious of your place in the scheme of things. And I don't want to bring too much spirituality into the whole thing, or religious ideals or whatnot, but if you believe that we are an embodiment of the divine in some way, shape, or form, that there is a spark of the godhood in us, then you can recognize that in everybody, no matter, even if they don't recognize it in themselves and don't recognize it in you. And for that reason alone, if you are plugged into that awareness and plugged into that oneness and that rapture or joy or grace, I don't know what the word would be to describe it, it becomes much easier.
Okay, great. Scott?
Well, I've heard the comment that you have to love yourself in order to love somebody else a couple of times, and I think I would agree in essence with what this statement is trying to say. However, again, we're using love in two very different senses, I think, because to be romantically in love with somebody else is quite different than being romantically in love with oneself. I don't think that's possible. I don't think anybody wakes up and suddenly feels that they're in love with themselves when they realize that they're perfect, or they're perfect for themselves or whatever. But I think really what that means is that a person has to have self-respect and a sense of self-worth in order to feel worthy of being loved by somebody else. I think love in the romantic sense implies a mutual interaction of, at the same time, having somebody to value, and also the feeling of being valued by somebody else, another consciousness, not the self.
Okay. Adele?
Carol, it's just crossed my mind after thinking about what you said about the love that you felt for your son as opposed to your husband, that maybe a lot of that mother love is also hormonally driven to prepare us as a species of women, to really care for our offspring. I've read that when you nurse, for example, you release so much oxytocin, which is the same hormone, that is released, that makes you feel great after sex, that goes through your body. So maybe a lot of that mother love, it also starts with hormones, just as perhaps romantic love does. But I wanted to say one thing about your comment, John. I love that idea of the two people kind of coming through the power struggle, because it does seem it is a process where in the beginning you so merge with another person, so nothing bothers you. I even went to football games at one time in my life, and tried to love it. And then all of a sudden, at some point in there, whether it's hormones or getting to know the person, your own boundaries come back, and it's like, is this me? And then there's that, how much togetherness and distance, and how much can I still feel like myself and give to another, and that is so difficult, but the path of love.
Okay, Carol.
Well, I wanted to share with Ken that I love a spring rain. And I wanted to share with Adele that I divorced the man and kept the child. Love is such a complicated thing. And is it something that we think we should do? Is it something that we think we should pursue? Can we get along without it? Are we fine without it? Do we need it? I'm not so sure.
Good question. Jerry?
I wanted to flesh out the the definition of love that we've been talking about a little bit. Sometimes it's helpful to try a negative definition of what love is not. Some people maybe offhand say that the opposite of love is hate. I don't think so. I think the opposite of love is indifference. Hate has such an intensity to it as love does, just that feeling. And indifference, you just don't care. It's just whether it's you don't care what happens to that person, or you're not interested in helping them along in life, helping them grow to their potential, that sort of thing. Does anyone else have ideas, negative definitions? I think it's a helpful way to think about it, sometimes what love is not.
John?
Well, my experience has been that love relationships can be tremendous growth experiences, even if they don't end satisfactorily, even if they end in disappointment. I know from my own recent relationship that that's been true of me. It's made quite a different person of me. And I wouldn't have missed it for anything, even though it didn't end well.
What do you think about Jerry's observation that the opposite of love might be not hate, but indifference?
Well, I remember a line from a movie that said, love and hate are two horns on the same goat. So they're kind of opposites of each other, and one can turn into the other. But indifference really has no potential at all.
Mike, you're next.
I guess I'm just thinking as we come close to the end of our discussion, ask a question. Is it possible, I mean, you asked an interesting question. In effect, is love important? Do we need it? Et cetera. And I think the consensus of the world at large generally is, we need love in some sense of the word. Obviously, we've gone through a variety of senses. So I'm just wondering, as a last question that I'll throw out to myself and to anyone else who's interested, is it possible to increase love? Are there actions, attitudes? Why isn't there enough love in the world to go around? I mean, there's an awful lot of hatred and destruction going on this planet all the time. So is there a way, are there answers to the question as to how to liberate love, as it were?
I'm struck by that question. What is the function of love, which is another way of saying what you're asking. And certainly we can do with less hate in the world, but wouldn't, for instance, indifference do just as well? In other words, could you have a peaceful planet in which people were simply indifferent instead of hating? So it's I think Carol
peaceful but dead, maybe.
Yeah. And it raises another question as far as the value of life, because there's a whole area that we haven't even touched on, is a kind of love, like a love for music, or love for art, where it really is a passion.
A love of beauty.
A love of beauty. What does that have to do in common with the love of people? I mean, why do we call the same thing love? What is the common denominator again? I'm still searching. Scott's next, and then we'll go. John?
Well, if the idea of love being something that we should work to expand and enjoy more of and spread more of, what about the issue of monogamy? If you're in love with somebody and you have no complaints with them, you're still in love with them, but then you meet somebody else that you're equally attracted to, and you decide to fall in love with them also. Would that spoil the first type of love, or would that could it possibly add to it, having multiple partners? So I just kind of like to throw that question out.
Yeah, good question. Jeff?
Well, I was going to say, I'm not sure how directly related this is to what you were asking, but real quick on Mike's point about death and destruction of the world and love, and if we had more love, maybe true love, maybe that's the case. But I often think of people tell me to stop smoking, for example. I say more die of heartbreak, right? It's the title of a Saul Bellow novel, and I think that's true. I think it creates severe problems. If we could all be ascetics, living on our own and not want anything out of life, then we could all leave each other alone, and it would be a very peaceful and very empty world. It's a great risk. I think you have to take it. So.
Okay, Ken.
Well, I'd like to address the issue of whether indifference would be a substitute for love. I say again that love is much more of a field effect, and in that regard is directly analogous to gravity. Would we live on the surface of the Earth better if Earth were indifferent to us? If gravitational field was not in full effect? If we were just sort of floating or hovering nearby and could drift off at any moment? I think not, and I think we have about as much choice about whether or not to engage in love as we do about whether or not to be in the field of gravity.
I like the analogy with gravity. Or was it Einstein? Somebody said something about you cannot blame gravity for falling in love or something like that. But isn't it true that love really does have a common? I'm looking for a common denominator. It's that of attraction.
It's for better, attraction, absolutely.
For better or for worse. Is it who's next over here? Jerry, and then. Yeah.
I think one way to expand love, increase love in the world, at least as far as towards your fellow human being, is just the little acts of kindness that you can do during the course of your day. Could be letting someone into traffic that's wants to turn, that sort of thing. I'm reminded of that movie. Pay It Forward, where a kindness is done and then you repay it. I think it's, if I remember correctly, like to 3 other people. I mean, that kind of equation works exponentially, and maybe it's a little sentimental and everything, but I think if there was more of that, the world would be a better place.
All right. Well, we're actually just about out of time. Maybe just one last quick comment from Carol, and then we'll have to.
Well, I mentioned before the dark side of love. And for an example, I know a family that has 6 children, and they were all abused. And when the children grew up, these children adore their parents. They're desperate for their love. And it's very mysterious that they still love after all the abuse.
Yeah, that's a provocative point to end on. I think we do have to wrap up our topic for this evening. It's been great, and although we haven't necessarily arrived at an absolute answer, I think we have, hopefully, acquired a little bit more insight and understanding on the topic than we had before. And so what I want to do now is mention that we need to pick a topic for our next time. And those of you that are watching the program, you do have a chance to become a guest on the show if you will email to philosopher@growingagain.com. Tell us a little bit about yourself and send in a topic. And if we choose your topic, you get to be a guest on the show. And so quickly, I'm going to grab my fishbowl here and see what we can come up with for next time. And what we have here, the topic is, what is evil? And that was sponsored by, or submitted by Tony Potter of Crozet, Virginia. So that'll be the topic we'll tackle next time. And thank you all for joining me, and it's been great. And again, if you want to be on the show, write philosopher@growingagain.com. And also visit www.teawithsocrates.com to find out about local philosophy groups that you can partake in here in Charlottesville. Thank you very much.